Hi guys, I hope you're having a lovely Monday. So today we're just going to start the unit with muscle physiology. Remember, we're going to do muscle physiology first, so how muscles work, and then we'll move into muscle anatomy sort of right before and after Christmas break. So without further ado, here we go. So today I'm going to go through the different types of muscle and then a little bit about muscle function, and then tomorrow we'll look at how muscles work in conjunction with the nervous system. So we're going to start and probably spend the most time talking about skeletal muscle. That's the type that you'll identify when we do muscle anatomy. You'll be identifying different skeletal muscles. So yeah, it'll probably be the most. So the reason skeletal muscle is called skeletal muscle is that it attaches to the skeleton for movement purposes. That's lovely. So skeletal muscle gets its name from its function, right? Movement by pulling on pieces of the skeleton. It's also called striated muscle because when you look at it microscopically, you can see clear bands, clear striations, or lines. And you'll see in a second what those look like. But it's identified that way. And that makes it different from the two other types of muscles, smooth muscle, and then cardiac muscle is sort of striated, but it has some other differences from skeletal muscle as well. So, yeah. So this, we're just looking at a sort of generic animal cell that you might remember maybe from biology versus a muscle cell. So you can see that muscle cells might have multiple nuclei. So there's one big nucleus there, but in the little microscopic image, you can see maybe a couple of the nuclei here, and down here. So they might have multiple nuclei, and they're also arranged in a very particular fashion. So you can see this, there's a whole lot going on. Sort of all jumbly. In this, they're very clearly organized in a linear fashion. You can see those striations that I was talking about on the last slide there. Similar to sort of a generic cell, they do have a cell membrane, and they do have a lot of mitochondria, as you might expect, given the work that they need to do. But very different in appearance from a generic cell. So, as I said, striated muscles are highly organized in a very particular way, as you would expect maybe from the function that they need to perform. So you can see here's a muscle sort of in situ, where it would be in the body. Actually, this is a whole lot of different muscles, and the deltoid, biceps, and then some of the forearm muscles as well. So you can see muscles are bundled together. So you have all of these fibers that are bundled and bundled and bundled together to make the whole muscle group. So here we've zoomed in a little bit more. So this is a single muscle cell, also called a muscle fiber. And so you can see there's some terminology here. There's the sarcolemma and then the myofibril. Both sarco and myo refer to flesh. Like that's their root word. So both of those are root words for muscles. So the sarcolemma here, that is a muscle cell membrane, as opposed to a plasma membrane, as we saw in the generic cell. It should be like plasma lemma. So you can see the nucleus there and there, the banding, and then you can see these long myofibrils that run all throughout the muscle cell. Depending on the size of the muscle, there may be between 100 to 1,000 different muscle fibers making up one particular muscle. And they are all encased in various membranes to help keep them together and working in a coordinated fashion. So here you can see a single muscle fiber. Okay. And those muscle fibers are surrounded by what's called an endomysium. So that's a sheath of connective tissue that surrounds each muscle cell, okay, around the sarcolemma. And it's endomysium. So it's inside, right? It's surrounding each muscle cell around the sarcolemma inside of these different bundles. So those cells are then bundled together into a fascicle, which is a bundle of muscle cells. You can see it here. And those fascicles are covered and surrounded by a fibrous membrane called the perimysium. Peri means around, so it's around the fascicles. So again, you can see muscle fiber. This looks like this with the sarcolemma. Then those are bundled together to make the fascicle, and you can see that here. Here's one bundle, and then a skeletal muscle itself is lots of these bundles, in turn, bundled together. Surrounding the entire muscle, so those bundles of cells, you have what's called the epimysium. Okay, so that's on the outside. Epi means above. So it's thick connective tissue that encloses the entire muscle. So here you can see it around the outside, epimysium. And so then the epimysium, connective tissue, is going to become and connect to the tendon or the aponeurosis at each end of the muscle, so that then those can attach to the skeletal system to do the pulling motion. So the three types of muscle, we just talked about skeletal muscle organization, and that will be sort of similar to cardiac muscle. You can see they have some similarities if you look at them here. And then here's smooth muscle. You can see that it looks distinctly different from the other two. There's a nice figure in your book, a little table that talks about the different muscle categories. So that's on page 159. You can look at that. We're going to talk a little bit about smooth muscle and cardiac muscle next. So enjoy. So here you see smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is not striated, it's smooth. And they are what are called spindle-shaped. So this looks, if you've ever seen Sleeping Beauty, I think. She pricks her finger on a spindle. This is like what a spindle would look like shape. It's for weaving. Anyway, so they're spindle-shaped. They are involuntary. So smooth muscle tends to be, for instance, in the digestive system. They're controlled not consciously, right. So you don't think about digesting your food. It just happens. Sometimes because it's found in the gut, it's also called visceral muscle. And viscera refers to like guts, basically. So you move food, empty the bladder. They can help change the diameter of blood vessels. So we talked about when you get too hot or too cold, your blood vessels change size. That's happening because of smooth muscle. The motion of peristalsis, which is sort of this wave-like motion that helps move food through your digestive tract, is done by peristalsis. And they can sustain long periods of contraction. So here is a smooth muscle in its contracted state. You can see this sort of net of filament bundles that squishes together and shortens the muscle. They can sustain long periods of contraction without fatigue, which wouldn't happen with skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles get tired as they are contracted. So, smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle, it is striated, so similar to skeletal muscle, you can see the striations there, but unlike skeletal muscle, it is involuntary. So your skeletal muscle is like you can move when you want to move, but your heart beats all the time. So it's involuntary, it just happens. And the other thing that cardiac muscles have that's different from skeletal muscle is they have these things called intercalated discs. You can see those are the dark lines sort of at each branch. And what the intercalated discs do is they help to make sure that all of the cells, like neighboring cells, contract at the same time, because it's important that your heart beat in a particular rhythm so that the blood can pump through it correctly in an organized fashion. So those intercalated discs help make sure all of the cells are on the same schedule, basically. Okay, so now we talked about the three main muscle types, so we're going to talk about their functions. These functions are different than the functions the book lists, because the book just lists things that really are all part of the movement. So the book's functions are a little bit more narrow than they should be, perhaps. So in general, muscles function by contraction, so by shortening, which is going to be important when we talk about different types of movements, in order to do four things. So movement, obviously, is a big one. So in the book, for instance, it says respiration, constriction of organs and vessels, and contraction of the heart. Those are all movements. So movement, maintenance of posture, so helping you stay upright, stabilizing joints. So we talked a fair bit about stabilizing the shoulder joint, for instance, all the muscles that are involved there. The other thing that muscles can do is generate heat. As they are moving, they'll give off heat and warm you up. So, four functions. These are the functions that we're going to use rather than the book's functions that they give. So, functional characteristics. So these are things that muscle cells have in common in order that they can do those four functions on the previous slide. So, characteristic number 1 is that muscle cells are irritable, or they have excitability, which means they can respond to a stimulus. So we talked about smooth muscle being able to allow blood vessels to contract or dilate. So the stimulus in that case is a temperature change, and the response is to contract or relax in order to maintain body temperature. In a skeletal muscle cell, the stimulus always comes from nerves, but the stimulus might come because you want to pick up a pencil or do something else. So the response to the stimulus is always contraction. So muscles will contract in response to a stimulus in order to perform one of those functions. So they're excitable. There's a stimulus. So next, uniquely, muscle cells are able to contract. So when muscle cells contract, they shorten. And as a muscle shortens across a joint, it's going to cause a movement. So here you can see the biceps muscle, and it is attached here up by the shoulder, and then down here on the radius. And so when the biceps muscle shortens, when it contracts, it pulls the forearm up toward the sky, let's say. It pulls it up. When the bicep relaxes and the triceps contracts, the triceps is attached down on the posterior ulna, and so the triceps is going to pull the forearm down out straight. So they can shorten, and the thing is they don't like lengthen, they just shorten or relax. If the biceps relaxes, it's because the triceps pulled and shortened to straighten the arm. Next is extensibility. So you can think about extension. We talked a little bit about hyperextension when we talked about joints. So extensibility means that they can stretch. So we can stretch our muscles, and they're not just one sit length. Next is elasticity. They're elastic, or they can recoil. So a muscle can be at rest here. It can contract, so it shortens when flexed. So you can try right now flexing your calf muscle, and then it should relax, right? It should go back to the original state. So that's what elasticity is. It can change, and then it can go back to how it used to be. When that doesn't happen, we get a muscle cramp. So when the muscle doesn't relax as it should, or it doesn't recoil as it should, it stays contracted, that is when you get like a leg cramp, for instance. So leg cramp picture on the next slide. So here you can see this is just contracted. It's not relaxing as the person wants it to. So it's lost some of that recoil ability or elasticity. Eventually, of course, cramps will go away. The muscles will fatigue and relax, but it's quite uncomfortable at the time. So that concludes today's What Do Muscles Do lecture. Tomorrow we'll talk about types of muscle contractions, and then we'll talk about how nerves and muscles work together to cause movement. So now you have some time to work on your coloring or your study packets. Be good, behave, and I'll see you tomorrow.